Hello quilters! Welcome to the 8th video in our series of quilts and projects using 5-inch squares or charm packs. For this project, you will need 1.5 yards of a background fabric and 5 charm packs, 2 of which are matching. For the binding, you will need 5/8 of a yard. The first thing you need to do is to pick out the charms you're going to use for the star blocks. I have black as my background fabric, so I'm going to pick lighter charms for my stars. Open up the charm packs that match and find 31 pairs of 5-inch squares. If I had chosen a light color for my background, I would be picking from the darker colors first. After finding the 31 pairs you'll need for the star blocks, set aside 128 squares for the 4-patch blocks. I have 22 charms left from the matching charm packs. I'll use those, and then I'm going to add 2 more full charm packs. And then from the last charm pack I have, I only need to pick out 22 squares to get the 128 squares that I need for the 4-patch blocks. If you'd like a more cohesive or limited color palette, pick 5 matching charm packs or get 3 of one charm pack for the 4 patches and 2 of another charm pack for the star blocks. And, as always, you can absolutely cut up your fabric stash into 5-inch squares to make this project. Once you have your 128 squares picked out, set them aside so you don't accidentally use them in something else. I put mine in a little plastic bin. And then you want to separate your matching charms into 2 piles. Each pile should have 1 of each of the pairs. Set aside 1 of the piles. I put mine in a plastic bag so it was separated from the other charms, and then put it with the other charms for this project. Take the remaining 31 squares and you're going to cut them into 4 equal squares. So 4 squares that are 2.5 inches by 2.5 inches. I stack 3 or 4 at a time, and I'll cut from one side on the 2.5-inch line, and then I'll put it on the other side and cut on the 2.5-inch line. That way I can cut multiple units at once. Just make sure to double check your measurement as you're going along to avoid mistakes. Don't worry about keeping the squares that match together. You can just pile them all up. At the very end of this video, I will be showing another version of this quilt pattern that is bigger and scrappier, so stay all the way to the end to see it. Once all the 2.5-inch squares have been cut, it's time to cut the background fabric. From the background fabric, cut 21 strips that are 2.5 inches wide by the width of fabric. Once I straighten an edge, I like to use my larger ruler so I could cut at the 12.5, the 10, the 7.5, the 5, and the 2.5. That's 5 different cuts without having to move the fabric. Be sure to straighten that front edge often so that your strips will remain straight as you do your cutting. From these strips, you need to cut 124 rectangles that are 2.5 inches by 7 inches. At the end of this video, you'll see the scrappy version of this quilt. I picked strips from my 2.5-inch strip bucket for a variety of fabrics used for the backgrounds of the star blocks. The scrappy version used up a big pile of my leftover charm squares, but the added bonus was with the variety of background prints, I used up some of my 2.5-inch leftover strips too. The nice thing about this pattern is you're not doing a whole lot of cutting. It's just cutting some of the charm squares and the rectangles for the background. Now that we're done cutting, it's time to start sewing. Each star block is made from 1 5-inch square, 1 5-inch square cut into 4 pieces, and 4 rectangles. You'll place the 4 squares that are 2.5 inches on the ends of the 2.5-inch rectangles. We'll sew a line corner to corner, and then if desired, you could sew another line 1/2 inch away from the first one, and then we will get the piece that we need, which is a 2.5-inch by 7-inch rectangle that has a triangle on one end, and then you'll have spare half-square triangle units that you can use in another project. The triangles will make the 4 points of the star. You'll start with a partial seam to sew the rectangles to the square. We'll start by sewing the squares, right sides together, to the rectangles. Place the square on one end of the rectangle, and then you're going to sew corner to corner. Now you can either draw a line on the back side of the square so you have a line to follow, or you can use diagonal seam tape to be your guide. With the right sides together, sew all of these units exactly the same, corner to corner, on the wrong side of the square, outer corner to inner corner. Instead of turning over each square and half of the rectangles as I'm sewing, I'm going to turn all of my squares right side down to make them easy to pick up. And instead of turning over every other rectangle to get the right side facing up, I'm only going to use the ones that are already right side up. I'll set aside the ones that are right side down. Then, when I get to the bottom of the pile, I can turn over all of the rectangles at once and just keep sewing. This is the kind of mindless sewing that I love to do, and I usually put on some music or a nice book to listen to as I'm sewing so that I can do two things at once. Once you've sewn that first corner to corner line on all the pieces, you can take them off the machine and cut them apart. Now you have two options. You can either trim the seam to 1/4 inch and throw away the excess fabric, or you could sew a second seam 1/2 inch away from the first and then cut in between to get spare half square triangle units that you can use in another block. I almost always choose to sew the extra line. 1, I hate to waste fabric, and 2, I'm already listening to a book. I might as well listen to another chapter. It doesn't take that much extra thread or time to get something else that you can use. Once you've sewn the second line, again you need to cut them apart, and then you can either use a scissors to cut between the two sewn lines, or you can head over to your rotary cutting mat and cut in between the two lines with your rotary cutter and a ruler. When I only have a few to do, I'll just cut right there at the sewing machine with my scissors. When I have a bunch to do, I like to take them to my rotary cutting mat, line them up, use my small ruler, and just go right down the line, cutting in between those two lines. And then it's time to press. You can press towards the triangle, or if you prefer, you can press the seam open. I will usually take the time to cut the spare half square triangle blocks too. And then you want to sort them into their matching color triangles along with their matching charm square. Now we start sewing the rectangles to the square. Don't let the partial seam scare you off from this project. It's quite easy. Line up the triangle end with the charm square, and then you're going to sew about 3 inches and stop. I like to stop with the needle down, and then I pivot the fabric, and then I can start sewing on a new set. Sew off the side of the one piece onto the new set, and then again pivot that fabric and just keep going. We're going to chain stitch this like we would regular piecing. You can feel where the triangle ends, and you want to just sew about a 1/2 inch past it before you do the pivot. Once you have one of the rectangles sewn onto each of the charm squares, it's time to press. You'll want to press towards the rectangle. Don't worry about pressing the whole entire seam. You just have to press the area where the triangle is. Once you have them all pressed, lay them out and match them up with the next rectangle that needs to be added on. I found it easier to sort them first so I didn't have to dig through the pile of rectangles as I was sitting at the sewing machine. Sort and stack them so they're ready to send through the machine. All you have to do is line up the edges and use your 1/4 inch seam allowance to sew them together. They should be the same exact length, and the nice thing is there are no seams you have to match up, so there's no nesting of seams or anything else. You will continue the sew, press, and sort routine until all of the rectangles have been added all the way around the square. The nice thing about having a consistent background fabric is easier chain piecing. For the scrappy version, I had a variety of backgrounds, and working on 1 to 3 blocks at a time was easier to keep everything organized. As you add each rectangle onto the side, always press towards the rectangle. I decided to use the Halloween charm packs for this quilt because I've been sitting on these charm packs for a while and wanted to use them up. But I think a Christmas version would also be fun to make. I also considered picking charm packs from a single designer, from different lines of a single designer, but the Halloween won out in the end. This quilt will finish at about 60 by 77, and it would be easy to make it bigger. You could either make more blocks or you could add borders. If you're needing a smaller quilt, you could get a quilt that's about 42 by 60 from 3 matching charm packs and a yard of background fabric. You would want to set the smaller version 5 blocks across and 7 down. For the smaller version, you would need 35 blocks total, 18 that are 4 patches and 17 that are star blocks. The quilt that I'm making is going to be 7 blocks across and 9 blocks down. 31 of those blocks will be the star blocks that we're making, and the other 32 blocks will be the 4 patch blocks, which I'll show you how to make after the star blocks. When sewing on this last side that you have, the last rectangle that you need to add, be careful not to sew onto the little flap that's loose from that partial seam. I would usually just flip that little flap underneath the block to keep it out of the way. If this is the first 5-inch square or charm video you're seeing from our channel, we'll leave a link in the description below to take you to the playlist with all of our charm videos. Make sure to subscribe to see more videos from the Quilted Forest. As you're pressing, fold the last seam in place so that it's ready to sew. To close up the partial seam, you want to start on the outer edge and sew until you have crossed over the stitching that you started with. After you've sewn over the starting line where you started, you can pivot with the needle down and then just keep sewing on the next block. Now you need to press each of the blocks one last time. Press towards the rectangle. These blocks should measure 9 inches by 9 inches. Mine came out exactly right on. I was very happy about that. There's a few other points I want to make here. And the first is that the star points don't necessarily have to match the center square. So as long as they're similar colors, I think you could mix 2 different fabrics into one star. So if you don't have matching charm packs, you can make do with fabrics that are similar to each other. Most of the fabrics in these 2 charm packs were multi-directional, so it didn't matter which way you look at the design of the fabric, it was going to work. For the scrappy version, however, I had a few fabrics I wanted to use that were stripes, so I had to play a little bit around with how to get the stripes to all go the same direction. So what I did was I just kind of played around to make sure that they would match up. I discovered that when you're sewing the squares onto the rectangles, 2 need to go up and down and 2 need to go across. Once I figured that out, the squares that I had used for the scrappy version turned out a lot cuter when I had all the stripes going the same direction. Now we're going to take the remaining charm squares and we're going to make 4 patches out of them. Start by just randomly picking up 2 squares and sewing them together. I tried to have lights and darks together, although sometimes it was a medium with a medium. At the beginning, because you have a lot of squares to pick from, it's easy to pick up a light and a dark. But once you get to the bottom of the pile, it starts to get a little harder to get a light and a dark together. When I had about 20 pieces left, I took some time to sort the squares into sets of 2 so that I didn't have to kind of end up with 2 squares that were the same color or the same design. You could pre-sort all of the entire piles if you wanted to, but I thought it was fun just to pick them up and sew them as I touched them. Try not to overthink matching up the squares too much. You'll notice that we didn't trim the squares first. We're going to do trimming at the end to get the right size blocks. You should have 64 sets of 2 squares sewn together. For all of these units, you are going to want to press towards the darker fabric. Before you sew the 4 patches together, I would suggest laying them out and matching up your units that'll go together. That way you don't end up at the end with 2 that are the exact same fabric or design again. Plus the sewing will go faster if you can just pick up a pile of 2 to sew together. Because you've pressed towards the darker fabric, you should be able to nest the center seam so it's going in opposite directions to sew the 2 pieces together. For these blocks, you can either press the seam to one side or you can press the seam open if you prefer. Trim each of these blocks to 9 inches by 9 inches. Use a square ruler and line up the seams with the 4.5-inch line in both directions. I would line it up on the seams, cut the 2 sides, and then I would flip the whole block around and cut the other 2 sides. I could have trimmed each square before sewing, but sewing first and then trimming saves a lot of time. It also allows each of the blocks to be exactly 9 inches by 9 inches, and sometimes the differences in charm packs and when they were made, they might be not quite 5 or a little over 5. This allows for all of that. Set aside 5 of the 4 patch blocks and 4 of the star blocks. And then the rest of them, you will sew a 4 patch to a star. Just sew through the whole entire pile. You should have 27 units that are a star block sewn to a 4 patch block. Bring back the blocks that you set aside and sew them to a unit of 2. We are making 9 rows of 7 blocks and they need to alternate 4-patch star, 4-patch star, and so forth. 5 of the rows will have a 4-patch block on each end, and 4 of the rows will have a star block on each end. After you've used all of the set-aside blocks, sew the remaining sets of 2 into sets of 4 blocks. To finish the rows, sew a set of 3 blocks to a set of 4 blocks. So here's the update on how many charm packs I had. I started out this video with 56 charm packs, and I used 5 to make this quilt. But unfortunately, I added 6 back into my pile of charm packs, so now I have 57. So, I only gained 1, so that's not too bad. Now it's time to press the rows. Always press towards the 4-patch block. If you always press towards the 4-patch block, the seams where the blocks meet will nest together to make sewing the rows together nice and easy. Once the rows are pressed, lay it out on your design board or a floor or a bed until you get a combination that you like. Sew the rows together, pressing in between each time you add things together, and press the seams in one direction. Once my quilt top was together, I picked out a backing and used cotton batting and quilted it on my long arm quilting machine. I used gray thread in the bobbin to match the back, and I used a variegated thread on the top that went from black to gray to white and then back to gray and then back to black. I quilted it in a simple stipple design, although I wish I would have remembered to write the word boo in there every once in a while, just for fun. The backing I chose was a Halloween print, and even though it runs the wrong way, I decided I didn't care. And here is the big reveal for the scrappy version that I made. The scrap version is 9 blocks across and 11 blocks down. It measures 67.5 by 93.5. And the quilter math on this is I used about 7.09 charm packs to make the stars and the 4 patches, and I used 2 1/3 yards of background fabric. Now they were all different pieces. I have cream, I have white, I have a little bit of everything because I just used strips from my 2.5-inch strip bucket. The binding was also made from fabrics from my strip bucket. I just picked a variety of greens. Had I cut this from yardage, it would have equaled about 8 1/3 yards of fabric. I picked out a sail fabric for the backing. I used cotton batting, warm and natural. I quilted it in a loop design with just a eggshell colored thread. I love how it turned out, and I'm really proud of how many charms I used to make this. I wish I'd saved a before picture, but this bin was overflowing and now it looks manageable. Before I start a project like this, I usually make test blocks, and these were 3 of my test blocks. When I get done with a project, I usually put those test blocks into my bucket of test blocks. Although that big bucket is getting kind of full, so I might need to think of a way to use these test blocks in some sort of fun project. And this time I actually made something with those spare half-square triangle blocks. I sewed them into little pinwheel blocks that measure 3 inches by 3 inches. I'm going to start a little pile of pinwheel blocks to make a fun quilt in the future. We hope you will remember to hit the like button, leave a comment for us, share with your quilting friends, and subscribe. Thanks for watching, and happy quilting!